Welcome back. Today in our ESL Methods class, we're going to discuss Herrera and Murray's chapters 7 through 9. As you'll see, a big theme in these chapters is how to integrate language learning into content instruction so that English language learners are still developing their English abilities while progressing and also learning the grade level content in the subject areas of math, science, social studies, and reading comprehension or literature. Let's begin with Chapter 7, the integrated content-based method of instruction. If you would like, in your own time, please click on these videos. They're great links to examples of content-based instruction. First, we're going to discuss the theoretical underpinnings of the content-based method. The content-based method developed through the understanding that in order for students to understand grade level content in school, students would need to have academic language, or cognitive academic language proficiency, CALLA for short. As we've studied in earlier lessons, it takes at least 5 years for students to learn CALLA. Often it can take 5 to 10 years even. So if students were only being taught language for the first 5 years and then content had been ignored, English language learners would be 5 years behind. That's why the concept of content-based method was developed. The idea was that from the very beginning, both content, grade level content, should be taught at the same time as academic language skills. So teachers should find ways to integrate language learning while they're teaching the grade level subjects. This way, English language learners would not fall behind their native English-speaking peers. Research supports the content-based method. They have found that students who are instructed with the content-based method, where they're learning content and language at the same time, learn more English and are becoming more proficient in English than students who are only learning rules or grammar in the English language. A strategy in which teachers use to provide content-based instruction is to teach content in thematic units. So you would have maybe a unit like the rainforest or under the sea, in which students would receive math lessons based off of that theme. They would receive science lessons about under the sea or related to the animals or the ecosystem under the sea. They would receive social studies lessons that relate to how people use the sea and maybe environmental needs of the sea and how the sea provides resources for humans. And of course, they would also receive language instruction based off of the topic of the sea. So they would read texts that the sea, both expository or nonfiction texts, but also fiction texts that have the sea as a setting. And so students would engage with the content throughout each subject area, and they would be taught relevant vocabulary based on the specific context. Moreover, because they were provided with a theme, they would feel that the language that they were learning is authentic and useful. They could see the specific situation in which it applies. Moreover, the content-based method further depends on providing students with hands-on, real-world learning experiences. So this could be giving students a hands-on experiment, or it could be providing students manipulatives to help solve a problem in math. On this slide, I just provide another example of theme-based instruction. So for the topic of financial literacy, in math, it could be teaching students how to count money and the value of each coin or each dollar. In social studies, it could be on that topic of financial literacy, explaining to students the benefits of saving money, the different ways people earn money, how you could donate money to help other people, and the difference between wants versus needs. You could even teach the history of money. For science, you could explain how the money was made or what materials were used to make the money, for example, copper and pennies. And for language arts, you would have students who are reading books, both expository about how money is earned and how adults use money to purchase things. You could also even have students read texts, once again, that are fiction-based texts that discuss a character who is trying to earn money for some purpose or maybe has an issue, like they lost money. And of course, throughout this, you would be teaching specific context-specific vocabulary, such as income, expenses, and savings. So this would be the unique vocabulary that's particularly relevant to this type of theme. The content-based method also focuses on higher order thinking skills. And the idea behind this is that when students are thinking more and there's more cognitive demand, they'll be prepared for more rigorous coursework when they get to be older students or when they go to college or into the career that they choose to perform. Also, as you probably might already have experienced as a learner in Texas or in other states, the educational system has become more and more focused on developing students' critical thinking skills and the ability to analyze, apply their knowledge, evaluate their thinking and what the benefits of what they're learning, and create their own demonstrations of their learning. And so, since the whole educational system has now emphasized this, these skills are more readily evaluated on standardized tests, and they're furthermore integrated into our curriculum. And so, in order to ensure that English language learners are successful in school on standardized tests, in college and in their career, it's important that you teach them these higher order thinking skills. Also, it makes students more actively engaged because they're the ones doing most of the thinking. They're the ones bearing most of the cognitive load in a lesson, where they're the ones actually discussing the content and making the connections. Some important critical thinking skills that we've maybe mentioned slightly already is information gathering. So teaching students how to find information or how to ask questions to find out information or to form research questions. You also need to teach students organizing skills, which is another higher order thinking skill or critical thinking skill. So organizing skills could be like teaching students how to categorize information or represent information in a specific way or compare information together and how they connect. Another part could be analyzing skills, where you have students and you teach them how to find the main ideas, find the difference between the main idea or the central part and the attributes and components, the lesser parts. Also, trying to teach students how to identify relationships or patterns. So often one that we use in elementary, for example, is teaching students the concept of cause and effect. Another higher order thinking skill that's important to impart on students is the concept of generating and the ideas behind generating skills. So these could be where students have to infer based on the evidence they've been provided, or predict what will come next, or even estimate based on what they've calculated before and their quantified knowledge, their knowledge of numbers and numerical literacy. You're having students find a rounded estimate of what a quantity could be. Let's discuss some of the benefits of the content-based method. First of all, it teaches language in a meaningful context that is particularly relevant to students. Since students see that there are real-world connections to what they're learning, and they also see that how their learning is interrelated through those theme-based units, they're more likely to store it in their long-term memory. Furthermore, they're also more likely to be engaged in the lesson. So if they're highly engaged in the lesson, they're likely to also store it in their long-term memory for years to come. In addition, students using the content-based method benefit from having the opportunity to regularly interact socially and academically with their peers. That's a key component of this method. And in general, also, students are required to interact with their peers in particular contexts that are academic. So they are given the academic vocabulary so they can hold conversations about the rainforest in science, or about how money works, or how the economy works in social studies. Furthermore, the content-based method, due to the regular interaction of peers, allows for students to practice negotiating meaning when communication breaks down. If you think about it, in everyday communication, at times people have difficulty communicating what they're trying to get across, their point. And so, as a native speaker, you probably have developed resources to accommodate that. So, for example, if you are explaining something to someone and maybe the vocabulary is too above that person's vocabulary, or maybe the words you're using are not recognized by that person, you know as a native speaker how to slow down and explain it in a different way. You also know to recognize that that person is having trouble understanding what you're saying. Furthermore, if someone else is talking to you and you're having trouble understanding what they're saying, you know as a native speaker how to ask for clarification, how to restate in different words, and to clarify what that person is saying, or at least paraphrase in your own words what you think that person is saying, in hopes that that person will give you feedback that yes, that's what they were saying, or no, that was what they were not saying. Also, if you need support as a native speaker, you know how to ask that person to either draw a picture, or use different vocabulary, or use a different example. All of those skills we developed as native speakers through repeated practice with our language. The same thing is what ELL students, or English language learners, must develop as well through regular repeated practice. The perfect opportunity to have this regular practice to negotiate meaning between the speaker and the listener is in the classroom, in a low-risk environment in which students feel supported by their peers and by their teacher. Those ELL students can practice negotiating meaning with their peers and with their teacher, so that one day when they're in the real world, in a more high stakes, high anxiety environment, they'll feel comfortable and have the skills to negotiate meaning and be effective communicators. It's important in the content-based instructional method that teachers present material in a variety of ways. And so when teachers are giving instructions, not only are they representing what they're teaching through visuals, they could be providing multiple media or multimedia opportunities through short video clips that are educational, or they'll also just have different varieties of activities so that students see the content in various ways. And this is important because as a teacher, you can't really predict how students will be assessed by the state, or how they'll see this content when they grow up in the real world. And so you want to provide them as many different opportunities as possible to see so many different ways this information can be represented or can be assessed, so that students will be successful in the real world and on statewide assessments. Another common theme that we've talked about is that when picking theme-based lessons, try to assume that, or try not just assume, but try to interpret what are your students' interests. And based on students' interests, what kind of maybe things they're interested in, what kind of topics. Based on that, you connect those topics to the grade level content and also students' language needs. In the integrated content-based instructional method, teachers create both language objectives and content objectives. You are probably already familiar with content objectives. Content objectives are the informational or knowledge goals that the teacher wants the students to learn throughout the lesson. So it's not only what factual information students are expected to learn, but also what procedural knowledge or what skills you hope students will develop in which they can apply that factual information in important situations. And so a content objective might be students will be able to multiply 2-digit numbers by 2-digit numbers. It's giving the factual knowledge and procedural knowledge of multiplying those 2-digit numbers by 2-digit numbers that the teacher wants the student to achieve through the lesson. However, even if you have that as your content objective, if you're teaching English language learners and students in general, it's beneficial to provide a language objective as well so that you can develop your students' language skills. For example, in that lesson of multiplying 2-digit by 2-digit numbers, you could have as a language objective that students will explain their thinking through speaking to their partners orally and through writing down an explanation of how they solved the problem. Or you could also say students will practice their listening skills by observing the teacher and their peers solve problems. And so, to specify a little bit further, the language objective is what vocabulary terms students might need to know to be successful in the lesson. Also, it could be what grammatical structure or verb tenses students should use throughout the lesson to be successful, such as the present tense or past tense. Probably in that example with math, students will be using mostly the present tense, or maybe even past tense if they're explaining what they did to their partner. Furthermore, language objectives can also include the necessary language domains that students will use throughout the lesson. I kind of used that in my first example of the language objectives, where I said students would explain orally through speaking with their partner and also writing down their own reflection of what they did to solve the problem. In that example, students would be using the language domains of speaking and writing. Ideally, you would want to have students in each lesson use all 4 language domains. So hopefully they're listening to the teacher and to their peers. They're speaking where they're sharing out with their peers and to their teacher. Furthermore, you would like to provide students with text to read and of course texts and sentences on the board for students to read. And furthermore, you can have students always write to explain their learning or summarize what they did or their reflection on the lesson. So ideally, as part of your language objective, you would explain how students are going to use the 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing in the lesson. I've kind of already discussed this in the last slide, but some things that you can ask yourself when you're creating the language objective is, first, what language domains will students use during the lesson? So how will they use listening? How will they be using speaking? How will I incorporate reading in my lesson? And how will I also integrate writing in the lesson? Remember, the more the better. Another question you'll ask is, what important vocabulary will students need to know? In that example of that math lesson, you might have to teach students the vocabulary of digits. You might have to teach students the vocabulary of product, the answer of a multiplication problem. You also might have to review or teach students who are unfamiliar with the vocabulary for the different place values, the ones and the tens. And you might even have to review the names of numbers because, of course, different cultures and different languages have different names for each number. Another thing you can ask yourself when you're creating your language objective is, how is the text that I provide students structured? And how would this text affect students' comprehension? And so based on that, one of your language objectives might be, I will teach students how to understand expository or nonfiction text, or I will practice teaching students the structure of fiction text. And so that could be another part of your language objective. Another thing you could ask as well is, are there any symbols, words, or meanings in the text that are different across languages and across cultures? And if so, as a teacher, you'll need to specifically and explicitly teach those cultural concepts. Like an idiom, like the phrase, pull your leg, or something like that, where literally you're not actually pulling someone's leg. It's an idiomatic phrase in English that's unique to English for saying you're telling a joke. But if that's in the text, or that's part of your lesson for some reason, and students are not familiar with that idiomatic phrase, you'll need to pre-teach that. And you'll have to explain it to them, because literally it doesn't make sense to someone who's translating it literally to their native language. Because an idiomatic phrase is just unique to English. It's something that other cultures probably have different terms or different phrases to explain it. So as part of your language objective as well, you have to think, what idiomatic expressions or what unique cultural concepts or cultural traditions will I need to explain to my students so that they'll be successful in understanding the content of the lesson. Furthermore, when you're writing your language objectives, you can also ask, is the language that I'm providing to students at students' current language ability level or proficiency? And is the language I'm providing to students comprehensible? If not, as part of your language objective, you could put, students will practice with the terms digit or place value, so terms that students might need additional practice with. Or you might have on your language objective that students will use the present tense and the key vocabulary words for the subject to explain their thinking. And this way, you're making sure that students understand what the language used in the lesson is, because they have to explain it to their peers, and they have to actually use that language in a real situation. When you're creating your content objectives, you should always think about these questions as well. What is the most important or the most necessary grade level content that my students will need to learn to be successful on the end of year assessments and in future grades? Also, when you're making your content objective, think, how have my students seen this information before in earlier grades? Do they have the adequate prior knowledge to understand the lesson? Next, you might also have to think about, as a teacher, how is this content taught in other grades, in earlier grades, or how is it taught in other countries? Some countries teach writing in a different way, a different organizational structure. Normally, Western European and American countries, native English-speaking countries, often teach writing where it's very formulaic. You have a thesis, you have a topic sentence for each body paragraph, and then you have your topic sentence is like your main point of view, and then you have details explaining or evidence explaining that each point. However, in other countries it might be different. They might not get to the thesis until the very end of the essay, and they might start out with very specific details and then later get to the main points in each paragraph. So it might be reverse, the organizational structure. And so it's important that you consider as a teacher, how is this content taught in earlier grades and in my students' native countries? That way, if you need to, you can try to appeal to their original learning style that they've learned in their earlier grades or in their home country. Or if you think that you cannot appeal to that learning history or that way of explaining it, then you can provide a reteaching of that more basic information so that students will be successful in the more complicated new information. Another thing you need to ask as a teacher is, what essential background knowledge would students need in order to grasp what I'm now teaching? So, for example, if you're teaching how to write a sentence and you're teaching the parts of a speech, like subject, verb, object, before you even teach that, you have to explain the whole concept of a sentence is a complete thought. It's not a fragment. Or a sentence begins with a capital letter and a period or some form of punctuation. If students do not have that background knowledge of what a sentence is, then they'll have trouble breaking down a sentence into its parts. As part of the content-based instructional method, you will need to gather the appropriate materials to make sure your students are successful. So when you're gathering the materials that you'll need for student success, please consider the following. How could these materials support students' content knowledge and support their language abilities? How could you as a teacher incorporate technology to help facilitate students' learning? How could you incorporate contextual scaffolds like visuals, real objects or realia, manipulatives, hands-on learning experiences, gestures, multimedia, like videos? Also, you need to consider, how could you provide native language resources for students? So there's lots of great websites such as newsela.com that provide multi-level text, so text for various reading levels, and also they provide the translation of the text in Spanish, which, as we've discussed in earlier classes, Spanish is probably going to, well, not probably, but is about 78% of the English language learner population's native language. Another thing you might want to consider when you're gathering your appropriate materials is, how can you find high interest materials that are especially relevant to students' personal lives, goals, and hobbies. Furthermore, you have to consider, are the materials at the appropriate difficulty level academically and also the appropriate language ability level. Furthermore, do the materials have a flexible topic where they talk about different topics, not just one central topic? Ideally, you want to have an article or a material or whatever you're bringing in that could be relevant to several contexts, several subjects, not just one. So students are not just learning one fact about one specific subject, but maybe they're learning something that can be applied across different subjects and in different parts of their life. As a teacher, you must also consider, does your learning environment emphasize the importance of the content? And is the learning environment providing effective opportunities for all students and meeting all students' language and academic needs? Moreover, as we've talked about with the effective filter and how students ideally would not have much of an effective filter if they feel supported, that they can take academic risks without being criticized by their peers. If students feel like they're in a low anxiety environment and they feel safe, then they're more likely to retain the information. So as a teacher, when you're developing your learning environment, you should consider, is my classroom safe? Have I made it so that students feel comfortable expressing diverse opinions, beliefs, and traditions, and that all of those beliefs and traditions are respected? None of them are denigrated by other peers. Furthermore, as a teacher, you also should always consider, when you're making your lessons and planning and also orchestrating your lessons, you have to consider, is the instruction and is the interaction between teachers, students, and students among their peers positive and encourage a willingness for all groups to learn from each other? Furthermore, as a teacher, you could also consider, are my students doing a majority of the talking? By that, I mean not necessarily talking about off-task, favorite TV shows, but I'm talking about, are students the ones having the discussions with the content, asking each other questions, commenting on each other's points of view, analyzing what each other said, and then writing down what they've learned? Ideally, the teacher wants to have a minimum amount of instructional talking, maybe at the very beginning of a lesson at the explicit instruction stage, but eventually you want your students to take more autonomy over their learning. So you want students to be the ones who are asking each other's questions, posing questions, researching more about something they're interested in, and developing their own plan for their learning as well as their own goals. Now let's discuss another element of the content-based instructional method that's very important. It's actually important for all three methods that we're going to discuss today. It's the idea that teachers must pre-teach key vocabulary. Regardless of the methods you're using, whenever you're teaching content to English language learners and any kind of learner in general, it's important that you consider, what important vocabulary or what essential vocabulary would students have to know beforehand, before the start of the lesson, to fully understand what you were saying during the explicit instruction phase of the new lesson. So some ways that you could do this would be, you could use graphic organizers to pre-teach vocabulary like the Fryer model, or you could use a bubble map or some kind of webbing. You could put high frequency words on a word wall, and you could even make it interactive word wall where students can use and group words together. Furthermore, you could also provide visuals for specific vocabulary words that are going to be discussed in the lesson to provide contextual support. Or you could also provide concrete objects, realia, to represent the things that you're discussing in the lesson. And so, going back to that theme-based lesson of financial literacy we talked about a couple slides back, some essential vocabulary that students need to know would be interest, borrowing, saving, spending, coins, money, finance. All of those things would be essential for students, and maybe also wants and needs. Those vocabulary words would be very important to teach your students before you get into the actual lesson. If students were not familiar with those vocabulary words, then they would have a hard time understanding the new content. They would likely get lost in the lesson and probably become frustrated. However, if you pre-teach those terms, those students already are familiar with them. They're more likely to make connections to what you're saying in the lesson, And they'll also be able to use that vocabulary knowledge when they're working with texts that are related to that lesson, when they're actually reading texts or reading word problems or doing an experiment where they're reading the directions in which those words are represented in the text. Building background is another key element of the content-based instructional method. When teachers build background, they start to ask questions to students to have the students reflect on their past experiences and their past knowledge on the subject. You also provide opportunities for students to reflect on how their past knowledge might connect to this new topic. Some ways to do this could be providing a free write opportunity in which students have 5 to 10 minutes to write down everything they know about a subject or what they've learned in the past, and then maybe share with a partner. Often when you're doing those kind of free writes, it's important to provide some kind of visual cues or examples to help spark people's connections to what they're learning. Students sometimes have they don't realize what they actually know. And so if you give them an image or you give them some kind of reminder with a hands-on experience, or you relate it to an earlier experience that they've seen in earlier grades, then they will be able to make those connections more frequently. Another way you could build background, especially when you have students with culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, is to invite their family members or community members from that same background to explain how the content relates to their culture or how it relates to their native language. And this way, students see the cultural relevance and the linguistic relevance of the new content they're learning. A key component of all three methods that we'll discuss today is collaborative learning. When you're developing collaborative learning opportunities in which students have regular opportunities to work with their peers, to communicate and express their thinking, and to work collaboratively and cooperatively on a mutual goal with their fellow students, it's important that you also take several things into consideration. When you're creating your collaborative learning experiences, first think, is this content or this activity that I'm giving my students developmentally appropriate? Will they be, with some of my supports that I give them, some scaffolds, successful in completing this activity? If it's too difficult for them, then students might get frustrated and they might close their minds to the new content that you're teaching them. So you want to make sure that your topic is developmentally appropriate so that students will have a high likelihood of being successful with your support and with their peer support. And that way, with that success, students will develop increased confidence and increased engagement in the lesson, which will later help them store in their long-term memory the new content. As we've discussed before, collaborative learning features regular opportunities for students to discuss the information with their partners. So it provides regular opportunities for students to practice the language domains of listening and speaking. Furthermore, an essential part of collaborative learning is to provide flexible grouping. And so you want to provide students with different grouping systems. So sometimes they might be grouped as pairs, they might be grouped in small groups, they might be grouped independently, working by themselves, or they might even be grouped in larger groups or even the whole group, the whole class together. You want to provide them various opportunities to pair up and to collaborate in different situations. Also, you want to make sure that you have mixed grouping or heterogeneous grouping. So you have students of various language abilities and various ability levels. This way, students who have more language proficiency can help be models to students with less language proficiency. They can provide students with new vocabulary terms and different ways to phrase things, more complex sentence structure or syntax, And this will be useful model for students who are still developing their language proficiency. In terms of content expertise, you also want to have students who are more advanced in the content to teach the information in a different way to students who might be struggling the initial time that you taught the lesson as a teacher. So this way, students can see it explained to them in a different way. And often, students will pay more attention to their peers. And so it'll be more likely for them to get what the lesson is being taught to them, because it's taught often with more simpler language because it's being taught by their peers. And also, it's being taught in a way that maybe students have a better connection to, since it's the way their peers are doing it. Moreover, in each situation, the students who had higher language ability or students who had higher academic content knowledge benefit from developing their leadership skills and also developing increased depth of knowledge by having to explain it and conceptually go into detail about how the knowledge connects together. Some of the best ways that you can learn a new subject or a new topic is to teach it to somebody else. That way you're forced to really become an expert in that content area and to really understand where are any possible misconceptions and how I can correct those to make sure my student or the person who's listening to me and my partner can understand it fully. Another thing that's important when you're developing collaborative learning tasks is that you need to develop interdependent tasks in which all group members have either a role or they are all held accountable by their mutual success. This way, all students are participating in the activity and not one person is doing all the work. So, like I said, one way to do this is to provide specific roles to each student. That way, the whole project can't be done without the work of everybody. And that way, everyone's involved and everyone's learning. You also need to teach your students how to positively interact and collaborate with each other. So you might have to teach them sentence stems about how to express their opinion. I think that, or you made a good point, but, or how about we. That way you're teaching students polite ways to either affirm what their partner said or express disagreement in a positive and polite manner. Also, you can teach students and model to students as well the importance of cheering your teammates on and providing positive feedback to your teammates. Another key component of the content-based instructional method is providing authentic activities that integrate literacy. So one way you can do this is to make sure you find ways to integrate all 4 language domains into the content material: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. You also want to, of course, ask higher order thinking questions and provide students with higher order thinking skills. In general, a higher order thinking question begins with words like why, or what if, or how. That way students have to think more in detail and to use the skills of apply, analyze, evaluate, and create to answer those questions. Moreover, as a teacher, you should appeal to different learning styles. So you should provide activities that are appealing to different ways people learn. So you should provide visual supports for visual learners. You provide audio supports, maybe in the use of songs or chants, and also in your oral lesson that you teach to students. That will be beneficial for audio oral students. who benefit from that learning style. Also, kinesthetic, hands-on activities will be beneficial for kinesthetic learners who like to be doing it and being integrated into the learning process by physically demonstrating the activity. Also, social collaborative learning styles are very popular for many students. Many students benefit from their interaction with their peers and from working together. That's how they best learn. And so you need to provide, of course, cooperative activities for students who are social collaborative learners to best understand the content. Furthermore, you need to always encourage your students to have extended discourse. You can ask open-ended questions. So you probably should not ask questions with what, where, or when so much as having them ask questions such as why or how, so that they have to really elaborate, not just give a one-word answer. This way, they also are able to demonstrate their perspectives, and they'll feel more buy-in to the knowledge they're learning because they are connecting it to their own personal beliefs and their own personal opinions. You can also teach students how to justify their comments through giving evidence. The content-based instructional method also involves developing learning centers. So learning centers, just for those who might not be aware of them, are small group interactions that students have the opportunity to reinforce their content knowledge and to work collaboratively. Often, they feature regular communication. So students are talking to each other, listening to what they have to say, and actively working with the content together. So effective centers for students incorporate both content and language objectives. They also should be collaborative and have a personal relevance to students, but they should not be too big or they're too large scale that they can't be solved in one class period or within one session of the group. You also want to make sure that learning centers are understood by all students and they know how to use the different materials in the learning center and what is their goal for their learning. You further want to make sure that students are given the appropriate amount of time to complete the activity and to have several opportunities to practice. This way, students will develop more of a habit in their learning, which will help them store the information in their long-term memory. Also, students will develop a feeling of success and confidence with the content. Furthermore, ideally, centers are things that students can do on their own without having significant teacher support. This way, while students are working collaboratively in their small groups with each other on their center, the teacher can be working with one group and doing guided reading or doing remediation in terms of going over the math concept and teaching it in a different way, or teaching the science experiment in a different way. This way, the teacher can provide individualized, differentiated instruction to students who are struggling. And these students will be more likely to grasp the material because they're going to be working in small groups. And so it's more personable learning. As part of the content-based instructional method, it's important that you also provide both an overall review of the content, and you should also provide regular formative assessments. So throughout the lesson, you need to provide continuous feedback. You need to regularly pause and check for understanding. And so some ways you can do this is you could ask questions. You could have short writes or exit tickets. You could have practice problems or reflection activities. You should also have students review the content with each other at the end of the lesson so students can discuss what they learned. And you can provide an overview of the key concepts of the lesson and the key vocabulary of the lesson. You also need to provide comprehensive feedback so that's in a way that the learner can understand. So you provide feedback that's detailed and specific to the areas the student did well and specific to areas in which they could improve on. And also you need to explain it in simple, straightforward terms that all students can understand and apply in the next time they complete an activity. When you create summative assessments at the end of the lesson cycle, at the end of your lesson, it's essential that what you're evaluating students on is the most critical information. So in Texas, this would be the readiness standards for the TEKS, or it would be the most important information that students would need to be successful in the next grade level or in their future lives. Also, you want to provide multi-dimensional assessments. You want to have different types of questions. You want to have assessments that maybe have multiple choice. They might have short answer. They might have fill in the blank. You could even have some matching. You could have essay questions. You want to provide various different activities for students to demonstrate their knowledge. You could also have them produce a product in which they explain their learning in a different way, either representing it visually or musically or in written format. This way, when you have multidimensional assessments, they appeal to different learning styles. So you're giving an equal opportunity for all different types of learners to be successful on the assessment, since you have all kinds of different questions. Also, you give students experience in seeing the material in different ways, which is probably how they'll end up seeing the material in the real world or on a standardized test. They're not going to only be seeing a multiple choice question throughout their lives or one way of doing something. They're going to have to learn various ways to solve a problem or to apply their knowledge. Also, for projects and writing pieces, it's useful to provide exemplars, like good examples, and rubrics to support student success. This way, students are seeing the model of what is desired, and they can use that as a guideline as they demonstrate their knowledge in the project. Chapter 8 discusses the sheltered method of instruction. These are two great videos that I hope you'll click on in your own time. The sheltered method of instruction follows the communicative approach, i.e., the goal of the sheltered method of instruction is that certain students learn a language through communicating and also through developing all four domains of their language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The sheltered method features clear, direct, simplified English when and during instruction is provided to students. Similar to content-based instructional method, the sheltered method of instruction features learning scaffolds, such as realia, hands-on learning, simplified text, sentence stems, graphic organizers, visuals. And similar to the content-based instructional method, students are learning grade-level content, but they're just receiving additional support so that they're successful in learning that content. And the support is primarily linguistic support. So some types of linguistic support or scaffolds that you can provide for students with the sheltered method of instruction could be modified language. So you could modify the language and use more simpler or more direct sentences, or more simpler or well-known high-frequency vocabulary so that students will understand the lesson. However, you do not modify the content. You still teach students the grade level content and the key concepts for each content topic. Another way that you can provide a scaffold for students is native language support. Native language support allows students to acquire the content and understand the content in their native language, which they can then transfer to their second language, English. Also, you could provide students not only with ways to hear the content in their native language, but maybe you could also provide them ways to read and provide texts and resources in the native language for students. Furthermore, you could provide students with opportunities to speak and discuss the content with other students in their native language, helping to develop their understanding of the new content. Moreover, the sheltered method of instruction, similar to the content-based instructional method, features high expectations for all students, and it emphasizes critical thinking skills. When you're creating your assessments, according to the sheltered method of instruction, you should focus on assessing students' content knowledge. You should not let your math assessment be a indicator of how much language ability students have. It should be based on how much math skills they have. And so sometimes when you're making your assessments, if needed, based on students' language proficiency, you can modify the language complexity of the tests. And you can see this even at the statewide level. There's an ELL version of the STAR test, which provides more straightforward language and often provides the opportunity for students to hear the test read out loud to them. And so even at the statewide level, there's a push toward making the state assessments focused as a representation of what students know about the content, not their language ability. The sheltered method of instruction further features language-rich classrooms, so classrooms that have word walls, texts that are and books that are readily provided, technology in which students can research and maybe get support in their native language, regular opportunities to discuss what they learned and to collaborate with their partners, and regular practice with their writing. Sheltered method of instruction further features content and language objectives, similar to the content method that we discussed earlier. There's explicit vocabulary instruction, and also there's explicit instruction on academic language structures and how information is presented in each area, like math, science, social studies. Students are provided with cooperative learning opportunities, and they have cognitively demanding activities, as we've mentioned before. A key component of the sheltered method of instruction is the concept of comprehensible input. We've discussed about this in an earlier lesson, but let's review it quickly. Comprehensible input means that the lesson delivery is understandable for students of various proficiency levels. And so students are able to understand based on the pace of the lesson, the speed in which it's presented, the vocabulary that the teacher is using, and the activities that students are asked to perform. Based on the scaffolds and supports the teacher provides, all of the content is understandable to the students of different language abilities. And so here are some suggestions or ways that you can provide comprehensible input under the sheltered method of instruction. And this comes from Vanderbilt University. And this is a shout out. That was actually my graduate university for my doctorate degree, so I'm a proud Commodore. So anyway, this came from my university, and let's discuss it a little bit. So some topics that are useful scaffolds for comprehensible input include speaking more slowly, so using longer pauses between sentences, and also going at a natural pace rather than very, very slow, like a slow-mo. That will get distracting for students. So just a regular pace, but a more leisurely pace than maybe you're talking to a native speaker. Furthermore, you could speak clearly. You would not use things like contractions, which are hard to understand. And you would also heavily emphasize key words to show that they're very important. When you're using your vocabulary, you would use high frequency words as much as possible. You would pre-teach unfamiliar terms or important vocabulary they might not know. You would try to stress cognates, so words that sound the same and have the same meaning across both languages. So like history in English is historia in Spanish. That would be a cognate. And so you could use that cognate to help explain the content. Or oxygen is oxígeno in Spanish. And so it's important that you show that cognate and to write it out so that students can connect that to their native language. Furthermore, you should limit the use of your idiomatic phrases like pull your leg or it's raining cats and dogs or time flies. Also, you want to limit slang and pronouns or even vague references to something. You want to be very specific. Instead of saying he, she, it, use the name of that person. Or instead of saying it, use this, describe the specific thing you're talking about. That way students can always stay with you when you're explaining the information. Also try to use multimodal techniques. So try real objects, pictures. You can label the diagram and short videos. You should also have regular demonstrations throughout your lessons and use gestures, use body language and movement, and even have role-playing opportunities so students can practice and see the information demonstrated in front of them visually. Be careful with your syntax. Simplify it. Simplify syntax. Keep your sentences short. Keep your clauses that start with that, which, or what, keep them short, or maybe even not use the clauses. Use basic simple sentences. Something that's important is that often when you're making your language objectives according to the sheltered English instructional method, you need to have a language objective for the different levels of language proficiency of your students. So here's a good example, and it also comes from Vanderbilt University. Let's say you had the science objective, understanding the process of photosynthesis. That would be your content objective. So understand photosynthesis in science. Then for your language objective, you could have different language objectives based on students' abilities. So beginner students, you might provide a diagram, and your goal is that students indicate which part of the photosynthesis process the teacher has described. So they might indicate by saying it out loud or by writing it down. Next, if you have students that are slightly higher intermediate proficiency, you might have students use that vocabulary terms to describe the process of photosynthesis in complete sentences. And you could have them probably write down their information. Finally, students who are really advanced and have advanced proficiency, you would have them use complete sentences both orally and in written form to describe the process of photosynthesis. You might also have them read grade level texts about the topic of photosynthesis where they have to answer short answer questions and write complete sentences explaining their answer or their providing detail for their answer to further meet the needs of those students. Chapter 9 focuses on the CALLA method, or I guess if you didn't pronounce it the Spanish way, you could call it the CALLA method, C-A-L-L-A method. The CALLA method, or CALLA method, has several central themes. First of all, it focuses on high priority content. So students are learning the most important language structures and vocabulary, and the parts and the vocabulary that's unique to each specific content area. And students are learning in authentic situations. So there's real-world application. Similar to the other two methods, language is developed through content instruction. So students are learning the content while also developing their language. And then this is the main element that distinguishes the CALLA method apart from the other two methods. There is an explicit instruction of learning strategies. So teachers are demonstrating to ELL students and to all students how to apply different learning or thinking strategies to better assess their learning and to retain the information. As I discussed in the earlier slide, the CALLA or CALLA method is most remarkable for its emphasis on teachers explicitly instructing students on learning strategies. Let's first describe the three different types of learning strategies: metacognitive, cognitive, and social affective. The first type of learning strategy is metacognitive. These are strategies in which students are planning on what learning strategy they need to use to be successful in the lesson, and they're also setting goals for their learning. Metacognitive learning strategies also have students think about what steps they need to complete the process that they're about to embark on. Furthermore, when students use metacognitive learning strategies, they're monitoring their own ability not only to use that learning strategy, but their own ability and effectiveness in learning the content. So they're thinking about whether or not they are actually understanding what's being taught. Some examples of metacognitive strategies include advanced organizers or advanced organization, and this would be where a teacher would have students review the main ideas and discuss how the content is organized. So an example of this might be teaching students how to preview nonfiction texts and to use the elements of nonfiction text like the title, the photos, the headings of each section, and the captions to better understand that nonfiction text. Another metacognitive strategy is organizational planning. So this would be where you teach students how to make a plan before they complete each task. So one way that we do this a lot in K-12 schools is having students make an outline for writing their paper. We have students make a plan before they actually do the explicit writing of their paper. Another theory is selective attention. This is where students focus on what specific information they need to learn at each time that they look at the material. So for example, selective attention would have students read a text several times. The first time they're reading just for general comprehension to get the gist. The second time they might be reading for specific details and understanding how they connect to the main idea. The third time they might be reading for character development or for a specific detail and to understand that detail more fully. So that would be the selective attention strategy. An additional example of a metacognitive strategy could be self-management. This would be where students plan how they can best be effective studying. So in what study environments, in what situations, what resources they'll need, and with whom, if they need to work collaboratively, would they be most successful in studying with? So this is helping students self-manage their own studying abilities. Some other examples of metacognitive strategies include monitoring comprehension strategies. And this would be where students, while they're listening or reading, they're reflecting on whether they're understanding what they're listening to or reading it. And so many times you'll have teachers have students after each paragraph think to themselves, did I understand the main points of that paragraph? And if students do not, they're supposed to go back and reread it. If they do, then they do understand it, then they can maybe move on to the next paragraph. Teachers should also instruct students on the metacognitive strategy of monitoring production. In this strategy, students evaluate their own oral and written production while it's occurring. So while they're writing, they're making sure that they're writing clearly and that they're using the appropriate language and the appropriate tense. Also, they're going back and editing their essays after they've completed. Or the same thing with when they're speaking. They're thinking and reflecting on how effectively they are communicating their point of view. And if they're not communicating as effectively as they would like, they restate or they explain in a different way the concept. Another metacognitive strategy could be self-assessment. So at the end of a lesson, the student evaluates how effectively they learned that lesson. This could be like a learning log in which students set goals and they determine if they've met their goals. It could be a way where after a standardized test, students reflect on what they did well on in completing the test and what areas they still need to improve upon, and also why they miss certain types of questions and how they can take a plan of action to learn those questions for the next test. A second type of learning style is the cognitive learning style. In the cognitive learning style, students reflect on their prior knowledge of their topic and how their prior knowledge connects to their new topic. They also could be asked with a cognitive learning style to make inferences using evidence and prior experiences. Furthermore, students could be asked to use imagery. So they could either physically draw images to help explain their comprehension or make mental images to understand and remember the content. Cognitive learning strategies further focus on linguistic transfer, where students are asked to see the similarities and differences between their native language and the target language, English. So they can see what were some things that they've seen before in their native language and how are certain words different or different expressions, or how are things written in a different format in English versus their native language. So let's talk about some examples of cognitive learning strategies. Some examples of cognitive learning strategies include resourcing. This would be where you teach students where to find useful resources and to have students think about how can I apply the tools to be successful in my learning. So you would teach students how to use reference materials like dictionaries and textbooks, and you would also teach students how to use tools like the internet to research and to verify their findings. Another cognitive strategy involves grouping. So you would have students classify information into categories based on similar qualities. So a lot of times you'll see this with a graphic organizer such as the Venn diagram for compare and contrast. Or you could also have it where students group similar words together, like words that are synonyms or words that have the same root word. And this way students can connect it to each other through association, and they'll be more likely to store it in their long-term memory. Additionally, a cognitive strategy could include note-taking, where students have to represent the main concepts using abbreviations or graphics or numbers. And you could see this, for example, in a T-list or in a semantic web, which I show you a picture here where they're showing the connection between key points. This example is a semantic web of different rock types, and you see how they break it down into sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic, and then they explain each element of those three subcategories. Likewise, a cognitive strategy could be an elaboration of prior knowledge. So students relate the new information to what they've learned before using things such as a KWL chart, showing what they know, want to know, and what they have learned in this specific lesson. Summarizing is another cognitive strategy. Students could either do an oral summary or a written summary of what was taught or what they read or what they learned. It's important to teach students the cognitive strategy of detection and induction. And this way, students are trying to learn the rules, so they develop their own rules or they follow the rules that the teacher has given them and they apply them to a new context or a new task. So an example might be you could teach the students the rule of gravity and the concept of how gravity is a force that moves people to the larger object. And you could also teach students the concept of relative gravity. And using that rule of gravity and relative gravity, you could have students apply that to a new context of how relative gravity differs on Earth versus space and what that means in terms of humans. Some additional cognitive strategies include imagery, where students would create mental pictures to understand new information or also use real pictures. You could have auditory representation, where students would practice repeating or replaying a word or phrase or piece of information. And often you'll see this in like educational songs or chants that help students repeat the information and put it to memory. You could teach students the cognitive strategy of making inferences. So how to use evidence from the text or how to use evidence from information already provided and use your prior life experiences to make an educated guess. This way you can make an inference for why something occurred. An example that we have for students always making inferences in our classes is the use of context clues to make an inference on unknown vocabulary words. In many texts, there are going to be words that students do not know. It's hard to memorize all the vocabulary words in the English language, but through teaching students context clue skills, then they can use skills from the sentences close to that unknown word to help understand that unknown word. So that would be an important skill that would be considered a making inference skill of the cognitive strategies. Type 3 strategies would be social affective strategies. In these strategies, students would be cooperating with classmates and they would be doing collaborative activities. They would be asking questions or making comments. You could also involve positive self-talk, so students talking to themselves out loud or mentally, in which they encourage themselves when they face something that's unknown or something that might be slightly difficult. It could involve thinking out loud. This would also be a social or affective strategy to explain students' thinking. Task-based learning, in which students receive problems that are relevant to the real world and real world materials and real world texts to solve that problem. That would further be an example of social affective learning styles and strategies. Let's discuss some specific lesson ideas that you could use for social affective learning strategies. The first one could be having students practice questioning for clarification. So students are always encouraged to ask their partner, teacher, or an expert for more information if they don't understand, or just to talk to their partner and ask reflective questions to get each other's point of view. One example of this might be think, pair, share, where students first think about their answer, then they pair up with someone and they share their point of view. Cooperation could be an element of the social affective learning strategy. And so this could be kind of like a task-based learning where students work with a peer to solve a real problem, and they could work with a peer to combine their information. So maybe one person knows one part of the activity and the other person doesn't know the other part, and they work together to combine it to make it one cohesive whole. This would be kind of like jigsawing when you're reading a text where one person becomes an expert in one element of the text, and then they later come together and put it together and teach each other it. During this process, you could teach students, once again, how to give positive, constructive feedback. Another example of cooperative activities, or cooperation as a social effective learning strategy, would be a situation in which students take turns teaching each other the concept. And as we mentioned in the last slide, self-talk is also an example of social effective learning strategies. And this would be when someone is talking to themselves, either mentally or orally, but it's used to reassure themselves that they can complete the task. And so I think of it as when a student would provide motivational thoughts about, oh, you can do it, don't worry, you got this, or you've seen this problem before, oh, this is like this other problem. Or just to talk out loud as they solve the problem as reassurance. Or to think in their mind the process in which they'll solve a problem to help organize their thinking. Some other types of social effective learning strategies could be paired reading or paired summarizing. And this would be where students work with partners and they read the text, or they take turns reading the text, and then each student summarizes the text in their own words. Then the students share their summaries to each other, and then they ask each other questions. And then they could also provide feedback on their summaries. The CALLA method, or the CALLA method, follows 5 particular steps. First is preparation. Students begin by reflecting on their prior knowledge, their language proficiency, and their preferred learning style. Next is presentation. The teacher provides various ways for students to access the content, and the teacher provides various forms of contextual support. Lots of modeling, lots of demonstrations, and also visual supports like gestures, images, real objects or realia, and multimedia. Teachers could also use think alouds during the process of the presentation step. The third step is practice, where students have various opportunities to work with the material and to engage with the content. Also, they're provided with various learning strategies, such as collaborative learning strategies, problem solving, where they could use inquiry or research, or also hands-on kinesthetic activities to practice with the material. And then, as part of the CALLA method, a key element is collaborative learning. So students are encouraged to work collaboratively and cooperatively with partners, and to regularly communicate their thinking, both orally through asking questions and discussions, and also through literacy, through writing. Also, students are asked to evaluate their own thinking. The fourth step, similar to what I just said, was the evaluation. And in this step, students reflect on what they've learned and the effectiveness of the strategy that they used to learn, whether it was metacognitive, cognitive, or social effective strategies. And so they would reflect on what strategy they used to learn the material and whether that strategy was effective. Further, they could also reflect on whether they understood the material, or do they still have some lingering questions. Likewise, they could reflect on how they could have learned the material better the next time, or what methods worked for them that they'll use the next time, and what areas they'll refine in their learning. So they're taking control and authority over their learning. An example of this could be reflective journaling, where students reflect on what they learned and about their experiences with the activity. Or it could be a self-assessment tool where they evaluate themselves on whether they learned the knowledge as effectively as they thought, or they had hoped to learn the knowledge. The final step of the CALLA or CALLA method is expansion. In this step, students are connecting their new content knowledge back to what they've learned before and to see the similarities and differences. Furthermore, they're using that new content knowledge they learned in that lesson and thinking about how it could relate to other topics or other areas, or how they would be useful in the real world. Another part of this process is for English language learners to reflect on how this new content relates to what they've learned in their own culture, or how the new words or new grammatical terms or styles that they've learned relate to their native language. So an example of this would be the what, so what, now what chart and reflection activity. So I included a picture of it, but during this activity, students would first reflect on what they learned or what they read. Then they would think about so what. So the so what is like, why is this information important? Why would it affect the students' daily lives, and how would it affect others and the world in general? Next will be the now what stage. So now that they've understood, now that they've learned the information, and now that they know that it's important, what are they going to do to help others? How are they going to apply this information in different contexts to make positive change in the world? Or how will they use this information in the future to improve their learning and the learning of others? So thank you again for listening to this lecture. I appreciate it. And I hope to see you guys, or hope that you guys can hear from me in the future.